I inherited my grandmother's ranch outside Oak Ridge, Texas last year. The place needed serious work. Walls were crumbling, roof leaked everywhere. During renovation, the contractors found something hidden inside the master bedroom wall. A letter dated June 15, 1985. It was never sent. As I read the words, I realized this wasn't just any love letter. It was from my grandmother to someone in Pinecrest, our town's sworn enemy. The forbidden love it revealed would change everything I knew about my family. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment if you've ever discovered a family secret that changed your perspective on everything. I'm Emily Richardson, 38 years old, born and raised in Oak Ridge, Texas. My grandmother Margaret passed away 14 months ago at the age of 78, leaving behind the Richardson family ranch, 800 acres of rolling hills, mesquite trees, and memories stretching back over a century. The main house was built in 1922 by my great-grandfather, a sturdy two-story structure that had weathered Texas storms, scorching summers, and generations of Richardson children running through its hallways. But time hadn't been kind to the old place. After Grandpa John died 9 years ago, Grandma Margaret did her best to maintain the property, but it was too much for one person, especially as her health declined. By the time I inherited it, the ranch house needed a complete overhaul: sagging floors, a leaking roof, electrical wiring from the 60s, and plumbing that groaned and protested with every flush. My parents suggested selling it. "That's a lot of responsibility for a single woman," my father had said, always the practical one. But I couldn't bring myself to let go of our family legacy. I'd spent every summer of my childhood at the ranch, learning to ride horses, helping with cattle, and sitting on the porch swing while Grandma Margaret told stories of the old days. Besides, as a freelance graphic designer, I could work from anywhere. The solitude of country living appealed to me after years in Austin's growing chaos. So I took out a loan, hired contractors, and moved into the small guest cabin while they gutted the main house. That's when I learned more about the feud between Oak Ridge and Pinecrest. Two small towns separated by 23 miles of dusty Texas highway and 47 years of bitter rivalry. The trouble started back in the 50s during one of the worst droughts in Texas history. Both towns relied on the same creek that cut through the valley, and when water grew scarce, accusations flew about who was taking more than their fair share. Oak Ridge, sitting upstream, was accused of diverting water and leaving Pinecrest to dry out. A dam was built, agreements broken, harsh words exchanged. What began as a practical matter of survival quickly festered into a multi-generational grudge. By the time I was growing up, the water rights dispute was ancient history. But the rivalry had taken on a life of its own. Our high school football games against Pinecrest were like small wars, complete with pre-game pranks that sometimes crossed the line into vandalism. Businesses wouldn't serve those people from across the creek, and heaven forbid anyone date someone from the rival town. "Richardsons don't mix with Callaways," Grandma would say, referring to one of Pinecrest's founding families. I never questioned why she singled them out specifically. I assumed it was because they'd been the most vocal during the water dispute. I should have known there was more to the story. It was mid-July, Texas summer in full swing, when the contractors started taking down the walls in the master bedroom. I was working in the cabin when Miguel, the foreman, knocked on my door. "Miss Richardson, we found something you might want to see." I followed him to the house, ducking under plastic sheeting and stepping carefully over exposed floor joists. The bedroom was stripped down to the wooden frame, decades of wallpaper and drywall removed to expose the bones of the house. There, between those studs, Miguel pointed to a space in the wall. Looks like someone hid it deliberately. Between two wooden beams, tucked into a space that had been carefully hollowed out and then sealed, was a yellowed envelope. I pulled on a pair of work gloves and gently removed it. The paper was brittle but intact, protected from moisture within the wall. The envelope was addressed to Robert Calloway, 3 Oaks Road, Pinecrest, Texas. The return address simply read M. Richardson, Oak Ridge. It was stamped but never mailed, dated June 15, 1985, exactly 39 years ago. Calloway. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. One of Pinecrest's oldest families, the ones Grandma had specifically mentioned avoiding. And M. Richardson, that would be Margaret, my grandmother. My hands trembled as I held the envelope. Should I open it? This was clearly private, never meant to be found. But Grandma had been gone for over a year now, and whoever this Robert Calloway was, he'd never received whatever message she'd tried to send. Back in my cabin, I sat at the kitchen table and carefully examined the envelope. It was sealed, the glue long dried and brittle. Using a letter opener, I gently pried it open, taking care not to tear the fragile paper. Inside was a single sheet of fine stationery, folded neatly, the blue ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, the same elegant penmanship that had addressed birthday cards and written Christmas letters throughout my childhood. My dearest Robert, the moon was full last night, and I couldn't sleep knowing it was shining on both of us, yet we were apart. I stood by my window looking toward Pinecrest, wondering if you were awake too, thinking of me as I was thinking of you. I can't keep meeting you at the old windmill. Someone from town almost saw us yesterday. Ben Miller's truck passed on the county road just after you'd gone. If my family found out about us, about someone from Calloway Ranch, I can't even write what they might do. My father still blames yours for everything that happened during the drought. But despite all the hate between our families, between our towns, I love you. I have loved you since that day at the county fair 3 years ago, when no one knew who we were to each other. I've loved you through every secret meeting, every hushed phone call, every letter we've exchanged. I've made my decision. I will meet you at the windmill tomorrow at sunset, just as we planned. I'll bring only what I can carry. The bus tickets to California, our new life together, it all seems like a dream. By this time tomorrow, we'll be free of all this senseless hatred. Mother found the brochures for San Francisco in my room today. She asked questions I couldn't answer. I'm afraid they suspect something. If anything happens, if I don't make it tomorrow, please know it isn't because my heart changed. My heart is yours completely and always will be. Forever yours, Margaret. I sat at the table for a long time after reading the letter, tears streaming down my face. My grandmother, proper, traditional Margaret Richardson, who attended church every Sunday and never spoke ill of anyone, except those troublemakers from Pinecrest, had been in love with a Calloway. They had planned to run away together, to escape the feud and build a new life. But something had gone wrong. She never sent the letter. She never met him at the windmill. Instead, she married my grandfather, John Richardson, 6 months later, and lived her entire life in Oak Ridge, just 23 miles from the man she'd apparently truly loved. I needed to understand what had happened. Why hadn't she sent the letter? Why didn't she meet Robert as planned? And most importantly, was Robert Calloway still alive? The next morning, I drove into town and visited the Oak Ridge Historical Society, housed in what used to be the town's first schoolhouse. Mrs. Winters, the elderly curator who'd been friends with my grandmother, greeted me warmly. "Emily, how's the renovation coming along? Your grandmother would be so pleased you're restoring the old place." I smiled and made small talk, then gradually steered the conversation toward the Calloway family from Pinecrest. "I found some old papers while cleaning out the house," I said vaguely. "There was mention of a Robert Calloway from the 1980s. Would you happen to know anything about him?" Mrs. Winters' smile tightened slightly. "Calloway? Let me think. Yes, that would be Robert Calloway, Jr. His father was one of the main landowners in Pinecrest during the water disputes. The son would be in his 70s now, I suppose. Still lives out there on their family ranch from what I hear, though his wife passed some years back. So Robert was alive." The revelation sent a surge of excitement through me. "What about his relationship with people from Oak Ridge? Did he have connections here?" Mrs. Winters gave me a curious look. "Not that I recall. Those were different times, Emily. The feud between our towns was much worse then. People didn't cross those lines, especially not the Richardsons and Calloways. Your grandfather and Robert's father nearly came to blows at a county meeting once over water allocations. I thanked her and left, knowing I wouldn't get the full story from anyone in Oak Ridge. The rivalry might have softened over the decades, but old memories ran deep. Back at the ranch, I studied the letter again. My grandmother mentioned an old windmill, their meeting place. Could it still be standing after all these years? I pulled out the property maps that had come with my inheritance paperwork. The Richardson Ranch covered 800 acres, stretching toward the creek that separated our land from Pinecrest territory. Sure enough, Marked near the property line was a structure labeled Old Mill, not in use. It took me nearly an hour to find it, driving my truck down overgrown fire roads, and finally hiking through a meadow dotted with wildflowers. The windmill stood on a small rise overlooking the creek valley, visible from both properties, but secluded enough for private meetings. It was dilapidated now, missing several blades, the metal tower rusty and leaning slightly. But it had been standing here in 1985 when my grandmother wrote her desperate letter, when two young lovers planned to meet and escape together. I approached the structure carefully, mindful of loose metal and rotting wood. The small shed at the base, once used to house pumping equipment, was still intact. The door hung askew on one hinge and I pulled it open slowly. Inside, carved into the wooden wall, were the initials, MR, plus RC. Below them, a series of dates, the last one June 14, 1985, one day before the letter was written, their final meeting before the planned escape that never happened. In one corner, a rusted metal box lay partially hidden under decades of dust and debris. I pried it open to find a stack of faded photographs and a small dried corsage. The photos showed a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, unmistakably a youthful version of my grandmother, and a tall, handsome man with sandy hair and a confident smile. They looked blissfully happy, arms around each other, standing in front of this very windmill, by the creek, at what appeared to be a county fair. Secret moments stolen in a world that demanded they remain enemies. I was 38 years old, and I'd never seen my grandmother look so genuinely happy as she did in those photographs. Not at family gatherings, not at her 50th wedding anniversary party, not even with her grandchildren whom she adored. There was a light in her eyes in these photos that had dimmed by the time I knew her. I needed to find Robert Calloway. The Calloway Ranch wasn't difficult to locate. Like the Richardson place, it was a local landmark, though I'd never had reason to visit it before. I drove across the county line into Pinecrest territory, feeling strangely as though I was crossing some forbidden boundary. The ranch entrance was marked by a wooden sign. Calloway Ranch, Esther 1893. I turned onto the long driveway, gravel crunching under my tires, my heart pounding against my ribs. What would I say to this man? How do you tell someone that the love of their life had written them a last letter that was never delivered? That she'd hidden it in a wall for almost 40 years? The house was similar to ours, a classic Texas ranch home, well-maintained, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A man was sitting in a rocking chair, reading a newspaper. As I parked and got out, he folded the paper and stood, watching me with curious eyes. He was tall, still straight-backed despite his age, with a full head of white hair that must have once been the sandy blonde from the photographs. His face was deeply lined, weathered from years under the Texas sun, but I could see echoes of the young man who had stolen my grandmother's heart. "Can I help you?" he called as I approached the porch. "Mr. Calloway?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "Robert Calloway?" He nodded, a wariness coming into his eyes. "That's me. And you are?" "My name is Emily Richardson. I'm Margaret Richardson's granddaughter." The change in his expression was immediate and profound. Shock, disbelief, and a flash of something that might have been fear crossed his face. He gripped the porch railing to steady himself. "Richardson, from Oak Ridge?" He studied my face more closely. "Yes, I can see her in you, around the eyes." "Mr. Calloway, I found something during renovations at my grandmother's ranch, something I think you should see." He invited me inside, his movements stiff, cautious. The house was comfortably furnished, family photos lining the walls. I noticed a woman who must have been his wife, children, grandchildren, a full life lived. But there was a wariness in him, a tension that seemed to grow as I carefully removed the letter from my bag. This was hidden in the wall of my grandmother's bedroom. "It's addressed to you, dated June 15, 1985. It was never sent." His hands trembled as he took the envelope, staring at the familiar handwriting. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, watching as he carefully unfolded the letter, his eyes moving across the words my grandmother had written nearly 4 decades ago. The color drained from his face and he sank heavily into an armchair. "I never received this," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I waited at the windmill that day, from sunset until well past midnight. She never came. What happened? I asked gently. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with decades of pain. I thought she'd changed her mind, chosen her family, her town, over me. 2 weeks later, I heard she was engaged to John Richardson. I tried calling once, but her father answered and threatened to come after me if I ever contacted her again. 6 months after that, I married Susan. We had a good life together, 3 children, grandchildren now. But he didn't need to finish the sentence. I could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. He'd never stopped loving Margaret. Will you tell me what happened? All of it? I asked. Robert took a deep breath and began to speak. He and my grandmother had met at the county fair in 1982, both 22 years old, neither knowing who the other was until they'd already spent the day together, talking, laughing, connecting in a way that defied the artificial boundaries set by their feuding towns. By the time they discovered their forbidden surnames, it was too late. They had already fallen for each other. For 3 years they met in secret, at the old windmill that stood on the boundary between their families' properties. In neighboring towns where no one knew them, once even in Dallas for a weekend, they'd both explained away as trips with friends. They fell deeply in love and began planning a future together, knowing they could never be accepted in either Oak Ridge or Pinecrest. We decided to leave, Robert said, his voice far away, lost in memories. Go to California where no one knew about this ridiculous feud. I had some money saved and a cousin in San Francisco who could help us get started. Margaret was going to meet me at the windmill on June 16th, and we'd catch the bus from the station in Midland that night. But she never came, I said softly. No. His eyes refocused on me. I found out later that her brother had discovered our plan. He found bus tickets in her room, overheard a phone call. The Richardsons closed ranks. Her father and brothers came to see me the day before we were supposed to leave. What did they do? I asked, dreading the answer. They made it very clear what would happen if I ever saw Margaret again. This wasn't just about family pride anymore. They threatened violence, said they'd burn our barn, shoot our livestock. He paused, the memory clearly painful. Your great-grandfather put a rifle to my chest and said if I ever came near his daughter again, they'd find my body in the creek. I felt sick. And my grandmother? What did they do to her? I don't know exactly. She was kept virtually under lock and key after that. Phone calls were monitored. She wasn't allowed to go anywhere alone. 6 months later, she was married to John Richardson, a distant cousin from the right side of the creek. He looked down at the letter in his hands. Now I understand. She tried to warn me, to explain. But they must have found this letter too. Intercepted it before she could send it. No, I said, the realization dawning on me. She hid it in the wall herself. Maybe as a time capsule, maybe hoping someone would find it someday. She never forgot you. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of 40 years of missed opportunities, of lives diverted by hatred and pride, hanging heavy in the room. I'd like to show you something, I said finally. The windmill is still standing, and I found something there, photographs, memories you both left behind. Later that afternoon, I drove Robert to the old windmill. He walked slowly across the meadow, leaning on a cane, his eyes fixed on the rusted tower. When we reached it, he traced the carved initials with gnarled fingers, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. We were going to be so happy, he said simply. I showed him the photographs I'd found, and he pulled out a wallet from his back pocket. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic, was a faded picture of my young grandmother, smiling at the camera, at him, the photographer, her whole life still ahead of her. I never could bring myself to throw it away, even after I married Susan. She knew about Margaret, understood that there would always be a part of my heart that wasn't completely hers. She was a good woman, Susan, patient, kind. We had a happy marriage. But sometimes I'd look at this picture and wonder what might have been. On the drive back to his ranch, Robert asked me what I planned to do with the letter, with the knowledge I'd uncovered. I think both our families should know the truth, I said. Maybe not the whole town, but at least those closest to us. This feud has gone on long enough, and it was never worth the price you and my grandmother paid. He nodded slowly. After all these years, maybe it's time. 2 weeks later, I hosted a gathering at the Richardson Ranch. The renovations weren't complete, but the living room was finished enough to welcome guests. I'd invited my parents, my uncle, my grandmother's son, and my cousins from the Richardson side. Robert brought his 3 children and their spouses, 2 families that had been enemies for generations, sitting awkwardly in the same room, casting suspicious glances at each other. "Thank you all for coming," I began, standing before them. "I've discovered something that I think you all should know. A story about love and loss, about how this feud between our towns, between our families, destroyed 2 lives and created decades of unnecessary hatred." I showed them the letter, passed around the photographs, and let Robert tell his part of the story. There were gasps of disbelief, tears and anger, particularly from my uncle, who had never known how unhappy his mother had been in her marriage, how she had been forced into it by his grandfather and uncles. "So you're saying Grandma never loved Grandpa?" my cousin asked, clearly struggling with this revelation. "I'm saying she was in love with someone else first, and that choice was taken from her," I replied carefully. "I'm sure she grew to care for Grandpa in her own way, but yes, her heart belonged to someone else. And all because of a stupid fight over water rights that no one even remembers the details of anymore. My father used to say that hate is taught, but love is natural," Robert said quietly. "They sacrificed their happiness for pride, for a feud that benefited no one." By the end of the evening, something had shifted. The 2 families weren't suddenly friends, but there was a somber recognition of the human cost of their inherited animosity. My uncle shook Robert's hand before leaving. Robert's daughter hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for finding that letter." Over the next few months, as summer faded into fall, word of the story spread through both communities. As I'd expected, reactions were mixed. Some of the older generation defended the separation. "Times were different then," they'd say, or "That's just how things were." But many, especially younger people, were appalled at the waste of it all, at lives derailed by a pointless grudge. As for the letter, I gave it to Robert. It was addressed to him, after all. He read it countless times over the following weeks, running his fingers over the faded ink as if trying to absorb some essence of the woman who had written it so long ago. "I wish I could have told her I waited," he said during one of his now regular visits to the ranch. "All these years she probably thought I gave up on her too easily. I couldn't bear to think about my grandmother living her entire life believing that Robert had abandoned their plans, never knowing he'd waited faithfully at the windmill while her family kept her locked away." As the renovation of the ranch house neared completion, I made a decision about the old windmill. Instead of letting it collapse, I had it restored. Not to working condition, but reinforced and preserved as a monument to a love that never had the chance to fully bloom. I placed a small bronze plaque at its base, for M and R, who loved beyond boundaries, and for all those kept apart by pride and prejudice. Love knows no borders. I didn't use their full names, that much privacy they deserved, but those who knew the story would understand. The first visitors were a young couple, she from Oak Ridge, he from Pinecrest. They'd been dating secretly, afraid to make their relationship public. After hearing about my grandmother and Robert, they decided to come forward, to challenge the old prejudices head-on. "If they couldn't be together because of this stupid feud, we're not going to let the same thing happen to us," the young woman told me fiercely. Others followed. The windmill became something of a local landmark, a symbol of resistance against meaningless division. It wasn't an overnight change. Decades of rivalry couldn't be erased in a few months. But there was movement. The high school football games were still competitive, but the pranks became more good-natured. A few businesses from both towns started collaborative ventures. The annual county fair featured a joint booth from Oak Ridge and Pinecrest for the first time in 47 years. Robert visited the ranch often. We would sit on the newly rebuilt porch, looking out over the land that had been in both our families for generations, and talk about the past, the present, and the slowly changing future of our communities. "Margaret would have liked you," he told me one evening as the Texas sun set in a blaze of orange and pink. "You have her spirit, her backbone. She never would have found that letter and kept the truth hidden." I wish I could have known that side of her, I replied. In my memories, she's always so proper, so reserved. That wasn't always the case. The Margaret I knew laughed easily, had dreams bigger than this small town. She wanted to see the ocean, to live in a city where no one cared about old grudges. He smiled sadly. She loved poetry, wildflowers, and dancing when no one was watching. That's the Margaret I'll always remember. As fall gave way to winter, I finished the renovations and settled into my new life at the Richardson Ranch. I kept the wall in the master bedroom where the letter had been found, adding a small glass panel with an inscription describing what had been discovered there, a reminder to myself and to future generations of the cost of hatred and the power of love that endures even when thwarted. Robert and I developed an unlikely friendship, the granddaughter of Margaret Richardson, and the man who had loved her from across a divide that once seemed uncrossable. We were living proof that the feud between our families, between our towns, had always been a choice rather than an inevitability. On Christmas Eve, I hosted a dinner at the ranch. My family came, as did Robert and his. There was still some awkwardness, but also laughter, shared stories, and the beginning of healing. As everyone gathered in the living room after the meal, Robert raised his glass in a toast. To Margaret, he said, his voice strong despite his years, and to forgiveness, long overdue. Later, after the guests had gone, I walked out to the windmill, now illuminated by small solar lights, and placed a wreath of winter greenery and dried wildflowers at its base, standing there under the vast Texas sky. Stars scattered like diamond dust above me. I felt a sense of peace settle over the land. My grandmother and Robert never got their happy ending. 40 years of what-ifs, of lives lived parallel but separate, of love hidden away inside walls and hearts. But perhaps their story finally told could prevent history from repeating itself. Perhaps that was the victory they never lived to see, that the hatred which stole their future might finally, at long last, be laid to rest. The letter that never arrived had finally been delivered, almost 40 years late, and though it couldn't change the past, it had begun to heal the future. Would you have sent the letter? Should they have fought harder for their love? Leave your comment below. Subscribe for more true stories. Share if you believe love should conquer all.